Welcome back, lads, to another Bannerlord map making episode. Today I'm going to take a little bit of a break from the existing map making and focus on something new. So I'm just about to start a new project, and while I was here I thought it might be a good idea just to show you guys the process that I normally take whenever coming up with a new map. One of the key parts of planning is getting a good concept together, as well as choosing the right colour palette for your map. You can just use the Bannerlord standard ones, but I guess the only drawback of doing it that way is that if you use the built-in Bannerlord colours schemes, you'll end up making a map that looks like it's straight out of vanilla Bannerlord and will look quite similar to some of the other maps out there. What I'm going to show you today is how I normally go about trying to make my maps look quite different from other people and what you might see traditionally. As always, if you like the video, be sure to comment and like below. Let's get stuck in. So, with any map, normally the first thing I'll do is I'll create a map, usually 16 by 16, but we'll go from there. So before I do anything, before I start creating physical features, I'll start with a blank empty zone, and I'll normally create a underlayer using the Mud AD diffuse map. So this is just a really plain dark, well, for want of a better word, base layer. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to head over to Google. So it's always good to look for some inspiration to the maps that you're making. In my case, this new map's going to be a sort of green, luscious Norwegian style landscape, and I'm planning to have a town slash castle somewhere in the middle with mountains kind of coming up either side. So before getting started, it's always good to look at a bit of reference material. Normally you can do that by doing a quick Google search. Just to confirm, guys, none of the images you see here were made by me. These are all just Google image searches, so obviously credits to whoever makes each individual picture. So let's take a look at a few of the examples. Looking at this one, you can kind of begin to see that, okay, so we've got a lot of greenery. Maybe if I take a look at this one, a bit more natural, we've got some quite grey green notes, lots of kind of black rock faces, as well as a tiny bit of snow that might be happening here. This is looking pretty good. From a colour palette perspective, I'm quite liking this. Usually what I'll do is, if I find an image which I like the look of, I'll often go see more, which will give me more images of a similar kind. So actually, just looking through some of these, you can probably begin to see some photos that look a bit like the last map I created. This one here looks pretty good. I can see again that kind of nice greyish green colour scheme, dark rocks, and actually almost in the foreground some quite luminous green. Also quite like the kind of hazy murkiness that this one's got going on. So as the map progresses, we'll probably have to decide whether or not this is a summer map or a kind of murky, cold winter's day map. But yeah, this is another good one as well. I think this accurately reflects what I'm trying to achieve. So what I'll probably do is I'll get started on the map, but while we're doing the map, we'll keep these tabs open because they'll be useful to look back for reference. So let's jump in and see what we've got. So first of all, I'm going to see if I can get the grass colours right. You can kind of see here that we've got a few different shades of green. We've got a light green, a kind of mid-range green, but also kind of a dark green as the grass mixed with the rock. So we're going to try and replicate those three colour palettes to see what we can do. So in the map, we're going to create a new layer. I'm going to select default, and we're going to give this layer a suitable name. So let's call this Grass A. Perfect. So I'll just use the brush to get a bit of a patch down so we can see what's happening as we change this. So in Bannerlord, there's obviously a limited selection of textures, for want of a better word, that you can use. They all look pretty good. If we zoom in, we can begin to see what Bannerlord has to offer. So there's quite a few maps available. If we go back to the reference material, what I'm looking for here is something that, start with the dark green, something that looks a little bit rocky but a little bit grassy at the same time. So actually this first one we've chosen doesn't look too bad, but we'll have a look through and see what else we've got, focusing mostly on the grassy textures. Okay, that's probably too leafy. This one's the best one so far, I think. Remember that, Grass AD. Slightly lighter looking grass. This one also looking pretty good. Not quite rocky enough. Bit too plain. Probably too rocky, that one. Yeah, let's go back to one of the first ones we saw, which was Grass AD. Yeah, I'm quite liking this one. It looks quite good compared to the reference material. So next up, this is looking a bit darker than the native Bannerlord texture. So what we're going to do here is click on it, head down to area map, and where we've got the albedo factor color, if I just make this a little bit darker, well, actually I lie. So first of all, we've got to click multiply. This basically is just it tells the system how to best apply the color on top. I normally go for multiply because it makes the texture change quite nicely. So if we leave it about there, that's looking a bit darker, not too dark, but it's much closer to the reference material that we've got here. This is looking pretty good. So next we're going to create another layer, and we're going to call this one Grass B. So once again, we're going to put a small amount of the texture down just so we can really take a look at how this looks in comparison to our other ones. So we've got a nice patch here. Next to this one, if I just create a patch over here so we can kind of see how one texture blends into the other. And let's take a look at this. So for this one, we're going to try and get a more of a mid-green colour, so something a bit more plain. This, I'll be honest, this middle green, this is probably going to make up the bulk of the map. So let's take a look and see what we've got. So we're looking for some grass texture that's a bit cleaner in colour. So yeah, we've got this one here. It's quite similar to the texture we chose before, but the rocks are a little bit less spread out, a little bit less thick. So it's almost like a nice in-between a main grassy patch and a rocky patch. Given that this one here is probably going to be more mossy, grassy, I think it makes sense for our mid-range one to be somewhere in between. So I'm going to stick with that for now. We can always change it as we go. So double click this one again, go to area map, choose multiply, and then we'll see if we can get a good colour on the go for this. One thing to note, I do have the colour picker in the bottom right hand corner, which is obviously the black and white scale. If I want to give it more of a luscious green colour, I can bring it over here slightly. You can sort of see as I bring it up here, you've got quite a strong green, looks very unnatural, maybe something after a nuclear warhead's gone off. But moving down here, I think the regular tones for this maybe aren't quite green enough, so I'm going to just bump it over here slightly and just choose something that's a little bit more green than it might have been otherwise. So nice sort of like earthy colours. So normally whenever choosing colours for grounds, I like to stay down the bottom here because it gives everything a slightly more muted tone, something that looks a bit more natural. So let's stick with that for now. And actually while I'm here, I might do the same to the slightly darker patch of grass as well that we did before. So this was our first layer that we created. I'm going to click on here, and I'm also going to try and make this one a little bit more green than it might be otherwise. Perfect. Great, so already this is starting to look pretty good. We're just getting the colour palette right. So last but not least, let's create the final grass layer, and we're going to call this one, you guessed it, Grass C. So once again, I'm just going to paint a little bit on the floor, just so we can see how one nicely blends into the other, and I'm just going to add a bit more to the middle layer as well, just so we can see the dark middle bright layer going into each other. So under Grass C, we probably want to find a texture now that's a bit more just grassy, not too much rocks, just the kind of grass that go around the edges. You can almost kind of see this mossy kind of tint. So while we're limited with what Bannerlord can offer, we'll try and find something that's as close as possible. I think with any reference material you'll never be able to get it exact, but what we're looking for is something that's pretty close. So on here, Grass C, let's jump in here and see what we've got. So these are the ones we chose before that had too many rocks. Ground 2 I think is looking a bit too foresty. We want something that looks a bit more open plains, I think. That one's too many rocks. That one, yeah, maybe not quite textured enough. This one's my favourite one so far, but let's keep going. It's always good to see them all. That one's maybe not detailed enough. That one's pretty good too, actually. I like that one. Let's just compare them. So grass D and the other one I liked, which was this one. I think grass D is probably my favourite of those. It's a bit more luscious in colour. Let's just check them out a few more just to be sure. So these ones are all pretty earthy, rocky. Yeah, you know, I think this is probably the last one of the grass. So let's go with this one. This looks pretty good. I think just looking at the reference material, it needs to be a bit more luminous, this green. So we'll just adjust the layers ever so slightly under the area map again. And this time maybe we'll go slightly higher up the scale. Choose multiply. Yeah, you can begin to see it starting to look a bit green. This is really subtle. You just want to make subtle adjustments. But I think that right there looks about right. Great. So let's just have a final review. If I zoom out a little bit, we've got the luminous grass, the mid-range grass, and the kind of earthy, rocky grass that sits underneath. I think this is starting to look pretty close to the reference material that we've got here. Yeah, fairly happy with that. The only other thing to mention is that we've also got this stream that's quite dark in texture. So the underlayer actually isn't too far off, but I might just update it so that the underlayer matches what's effectively going to be the riverbed. So let's jump on the underlayer. We've got mud, which might be okay for a riverbed. Let's just see what else we've got to play with. I think I've seen one or two quite rocky textures in here in the past. Let's just see what we've got. Obviously don't focus too much on the colour of these so far. We're just looking for something that looks like it's got the right texture. That looks a bit too man-made. A bit too rocky. Too busy. Looking for something that looks a bit more like a cliff face or a rock or something like that. Yeah, okay, this one's not looking too bad. Rock brown. Looks a bit too repetitive. Maybe that's more of a cliff face than a riverbed. Yeah, I think this rock... brown one that we saw looks like the nicest. So, same as always, because this is going to be the riverbed, I'm going to jump into the area map, choose multiply, and we're going to make this really, really dark. And actually, based on the reference material, it's almost black in colour, so we probably want to make this as dark as it possibly can be while just balancing it. So I'm going to make this slightly lighter than the reference material, just because while it's good to get it as close as possible, you also want to choose something that looks good with the Bannerlord engine. So this is looking pretty good. I think let's just do a quick test to see how this looks with something a bit more 3D. So bear me a second while I remind myself how to raise the water levels. Perfect. So if we choose the level to be 1, good, we've got a shallow pool of water here. Excellent. Actually, if we make it 0, or perhaps even -3, that means the water's sat just below where our texture is. So let's get the elevation tool out. We'll select lower, and we'll just try and create a little riverbank. In fact, maybe not even with lower, let's just go flatten, and we'll set the flatten to -6, so that's just 3 below the water level plate. So let's just draw a quick river that goes around the corner here. And actually, just to try and make it as best as possible, let's make it a little bit less deep, a little bit more narrow, and go like this. Ooh, that should be -5 and not 5. Yeah, I'm quite liking this. So while this is more about the textures, I'm just going to smoothen it out as well, just to make the edges a bit more less steep. Perfect. Right, let's get our textures out and see how these look in practice. So normally I'll start with the bottom layer first and build them up. So if we do a layer of this all the way around the edge, this is going to be our kind of base layer. Perfect. So because I'm doing a demo, I'm not going to worry too much about the tidiness of this. We can obviously come back and tidy it up a bit more later. Great. So closer to the riverbank, we've obviously got it starting to go a bit lighter. So if I do a slightly smaller strip of the mid-range green around the edges. Nice. Another thing to mention is that sometimes I'd use the pattern brushes, so on and so forth, but for this video I'm just trying to keep it simple. And actually I'm going to make this go right up to the edge, because obviously we can layer these up, so it doesn't have to be an exact science. Think of Bob Ross. Happy little accidents. Okay, and then finally the grass C. And actually if I was to take a look at this, you can see that it's really just right on the tips of the banks that we get this slightly more mossy effect. So I'm just going to go around the edges and get this really thin layer of moss happening. So the reason for doing this is really just because when you see them flat, it's sometimes difficult to kind of understand the true effect. So what I'm doing here, I might not even keep this probably won't form part of the final map, but it's just giving me a bit of an idea about how this is going to look in practice once the map is done. Okay, I think this is looking pretty good. I'm just going to tidy up some of the edges around here, get a bit more of the rocky bank showing. Nice. Very nice. Maybe a bit more around here as well. So I think the colours of that are looking quite good. So let's just play with them a little bit. I think maybe this light green needs to be a little bit less of a deep green and a slightly more lighter green. So I'm just going to come back here, change the colours ever so slightly to something that I think looks a bit better. So again, this is where I'm just taking a bit of artistic license and changing the colours slightly. Let's go with something a bit more yellow in colour. There we go. Nice. And grass B. Let's do some minor adjustments here as well. Excellent. Maybe slightly darker, muted. Yeah, okay, so we're starting to get there. Very nice. So the colour palette's starting to come together, and I'm quite liking how this is beginning to shape up. So I'm not going to show you too much more than this really. This video is just about the colour palette and how best to choose one for your map. So just to recap, find a good reference picture to use. Once you've got that, try and mimic the colour palette as best as possible. And once you've got these down, this can form the basis of your map. Normally with any ground, I try and get at least 3 textures in, but obviously as the map progresses and you create different areas, you'll find that your number of textures will grow. So, taking this as an example, when we come to do the mountain, we might add a 3rd texture in, so on and so forth. What else to do? So maybe just before we go, the other last thing I might show you is just to help with the colour palette. So normally with any river, we'll maybe add some rocks to it to try and show the cliff face. So these ones are looking a slightly different colour because I've already got them updated in the kind of master prefab. But if I scale these down slightly, let's update these to find a colour that's suitable to this map. So we're going to plop that one down there. We're going to grab another one, adjust the size to something a bit more suitable, and also just plop that one down there next to it. So with any riverbank, normally I'll try and line it with some rocks that look a bit like this. We can use the tool for moving it, which is T, just to kind of adjust it slightly and move it around. I think the key to a good cliff face is to find a rock that just very nicely hugs the natural landscape that you've got, so we can move it around until we find something that we feel works for us. Maybe we'll just move that one up slightly, move it back, rotate it around. Yeah, so we've got some landscape looking pretty good there. I think actually looking at this, you can kind of see that the rocks slightly are too low down because the land starts to dip before we get to them. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come back to these, maybe decrease the sensitivity of the camera. Just, there we go, that's a bit better. And we're going to hold down B, make them a little bit larger than they were previously. Space them out a bit, and then we're going to use X to roll them backwards a little bit into the landscape, and then T to move them, Z to rotate them. Yeah, it's getting there. I think that's probably passable. If you were someone standing here, it would be quite nice to kind of be able to have some visibility over the water. We don't want the rocks to come up too high. Yeah, this is looking a bit better. I'd say around the rocks, if I go back to my brush tool, we can start to bring grass C around them a little bit if I use the paint tool. Just kind of bring it around. I may even just erase a little bit quite close to the rocks just to give it that idea that maybe the rocks blend in slightly rather than being directly attached to the grass. It's looking pretty good. Pretty good. Do the same with this one. Nice. So again, that's starting to look pretty natural from what I can see. Last but not least, normally we'll add some flora to the grass. So this is all part of setting the scene in the mood, really. The grass all looks pretty flat right now, so there's two things we can do to it to try and give it a bit more depth and realism. If I click on lighting and go to parallax, you'll notice that in the, so this is the deep layer here, in the grass we have height maps. So parallax, I believe, my understanding of it, uses this height map to achieve some, or to fake some height. So if I set this to a high number, you can begin to see that the height changes slightly, and it's almost kind of faked a little bit to give it a bit of texture. So we don't want to overdo this, but if I set this to be slightly bigger, maybe like this, it just gives the illusion that there's a bit more height than there might otherwise be. Under grass B, we'll do the same. We'll jump on the lighting, parallax, and we'll just bump this up slightly. That's looking pretty good. And then for grass C, this one probably wants to be a bit flatter, but we'll add some anyway. I think it's always good good to add a little bit of parallax to get a bit more 3D-ness going on. Very nice. So you can sometimes, it gets a bit funny when two layers overlay, but I think it looks alright. I think this is starting to look pretty good. So last but not least, let's get some flora into the map. So this is where we give what would otherwise be quite a flat texture a bit more of a 3D-ness. For those that have used the flora tool, you're probably quite familiar with this, but right at the bottom, if you double click on a layer, you've got the flora meshes. So this allows you basically to choose some plants. So if I was to choose this one, you can see some plants appearing in the distance, but if I up the density, you'll see we've got a bit more. I think if I decrease the colony radius, there'll be a bit more widespread. So okay, so this is giving you an idea about what the flora tool does. It just gives you plants effectively, or entities that are randomly spread across the paint layer. So let's find something that best resembles kind of fine mossy grass, because we want this to line the bank. So we've got this, which is quite thick grass. I wouldn't worry too much about the size. What we're looking for really is the texture, because through the flora meshes we can change the minimum size. You know, if I wanted to make them smaller, I could change this down. Oh, that should be 0.5. Yeah, you can begin to see how that might work in practice. So let's just see what other grass options we've got. Grass B. Well, yeah, that was looking a bit better. For the sake of this video, I'm just going to go with this very simple grassy texture. So because this is supposed to be moss lining a bank, I think we want it to be as thick as possible. So let's try and change the density to a low point so that we get a lot. You just want to play with these settings to try and find the value that works best for you. So I'm trying to get a really thick amount of grass around the edges. And obviously you'll only get the flora where the paint is, so if there are patches where there isn't too much happening, you can go back to grass, see, and paint in some extra, and as you paint you'll begin to see more of the plants appear. Great. This is looking alright. Just going to see if we can make it even more dense. I want to try and make the size as small as possible, because I'm trying to get like a slightly more mossy effect. Maybe if we up the density a bit more, yeah. I think there is a maximum that can be achieved on Bannerlord, because obviously they're trying to preserve the player's CPU, I guess. Okay, but that's looking pretty good. So on the layer back, let's try and do something similar on the flora meshes. We want something again that's a little bit grassy but maybe a slightly different colour. And actually on that note, I am going to go back to the flora texture, because similar to the main texture, you can change the colour of the flora. So this doesn't change it per se, but it almost blends an extra colour layer into it. So we want something a bit more yellowy green that matches the under layer. So I always try and blend the flora and the layer underneath as best as possible to try and find a good match. So I think while not perfect, that's probably quite close. So we'll go with that for now. Very nice. Grass B. This one's a bit more rocky, so I think we're going to go with grass again on this one, but it's going to be a bit more spread out. So if we find some grass again, maybe I'll just change the density so we can actually get a few examples of what it is that we're playing with. I mean, this doesn't look too bad actually, just as a random selection, but we're going to have a look through and see what we can find. Good tip is just to kind of click in there, press the up and down keys until you find something that you like the look of. Yeah, this is all looking alright. Just going to go through a few more to see what we've got. I think the grass there looks quite good. Let's just see what else we've got just in case. Yeah, let's go use that grass for now. I think, you know, as the map progresses, we'll be able to have a play around with this. So this actually is the one I used in my last map. It's a bit more grey in colour, so we could use this. We could use one of the other grasses. Let's use this one for this map. So density I think is a bit too dense, so let's decrease the density, maybe not quite that much, but just so we got some patches of grass. And again, similar to before, we're just going to play with the settings. So colony radius probably needs to go up a little bit. I think colony radius is just the gaps between sets of plants, so maybe we'll make that, yeah, 180 looks pretty good. Nice. So let's again just down the size, max size slightly to make it a bit more natural looking. I don't want this to be too big. Yeah, I'm quite happy with that. And then finally the grassy rocks right at the end. We're going to do something similar. So floral meshes. This time we're going to try and find something that's a bit more rocky in nature. I think we want a combination of rocks and grass. So let's start with the grass. This is probably a good place to end the video. So let's get some rocks. In there. Something a bit subtle. Yeah, I mean that's quite nice. I quite like that. That looks quite natural. Gives it a bit more 3D-ness. Very nice. We're just going to modify the colour now to make them a bit darker so that they blend into the landscape. Maybe going to choose something a little bit green. And then bring the darkness down slightly. Yeah, that's looking quite good. Very nice. I think with the rocks, we don't want them to be too dense. So let's decrease the density slightly till we've got something we like. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And then I mentioned that I was going to have rocks and grass on this one. So the nice thing about floral meshes is that you can have multiple floral meshes. So if I choose another one, maybe we'll just up the density slightly so we can see a few more examples. I'm going to try and find some slightly different looking grass from what we had before. Just so you know, this same floral mesh technique can be used for doing trees and things as well. I think look, there you go, there's some trees, but we're going to stick with the plants for now. So let's use these ones for now. So I'm going to make the max size slightly smaller than it might otherwise be. We're going to adapt the colour slightly to make them a bit more dark and blended with the colour palette and the landscape. This is looking pretty good. Decrease the colony radius, maybe up the density slightly. You can kind of begin to see now that this thing's coming together. So some of the plants that we added from this layer, because we've overlapped the layers, they do obviously start to intertwine with each other. So obviously if we don't want these plants to show up on the mossy bank, what we can do is go to the erase tool and just make sure that we remove those around the edges. All the way around. So yeah, I mean this obviously needs a lot more work, but really I just wanted to show you how the map might come together and how you can achieve the right colour palettes. I think the final thing to do, I'm just going to click on these rocks, and again I'll click this and lower the colour. So that's obviously the natural Bannerlord colour, but if I make them a bit darker, I want them to match the kind of like rockiness that's happening in the dark water below. So that looks quite good. I quite like that. Thank you guys. So this was just a quick Bannerlord episode just to show you how I would normally start making a map. Just before I go guys, I just wanted to show you the finished result. So after the video I spent a bit of time just playing with the colours, playing with the size of some of the flora and the entities chosen. I found a layout that looks pretty good. So just to go through, I've added a few rocks, I've smoothed it out, added a bit more elevation. Normally what I'll do for this is I'll use the flatten tool just to get 3 different tiers and then smoothen it out to create this nice kind of bank. But you can see here I've added a guy for reference just so that you can kind of see how big everything is in relation to a player. But yeah, very happy with this, and yeah, I'm quite excited to see how this one plays out. Thanks for watching.